Welcome, everyone. We're going to get started, officially started. Welcome to Exploring the Environmental Costs of AI. My name is Michael Conswicks. I'm the Associate Director here at the Institute for Public Knowledge. Bless you. Thank you all for being so brave and going through the weather and dealing with all the subway delays. We really appreciate you being here, and we appreciate everyone also being online to watch a really fantastic conversation. Before we introduce the panel, I'd like to introduce the person who made this event happen, and that is Benedetta Brevini, who is standing behind me. Benedetta, yes, thank you, is a visiting scholar here at IPK. We've been happy to have her here for the last 3 semesters, but is also Associate Professor of Political Economy and Communication at the University of Sydney and Senior Fellow at the London School of Economics and Political Science. She writes for numerous publications, including The Guardian, South China Morning Post, Open Democracy and the Conversation, and is the author of several books, most recently News Corp, Empire of Influence, but also books such as Amazon, Understanding of Global Communication, Public Service Broadcasting Online, Beyond WikiLeaks, Carbon Capitalism and Communication, Confronting Climate Crisis, and Climate Change and the Media. So please welcome Benedetta Brevini.
Thank you, Mike, for the wonderful introduction, and thank you to everybody for being here, and for the people at home. Good morning to the many people that I know are joining us from London, from Europe, and trying to engage in this conversation that is truly global. So as we gather today, we also know that the world is meeting at the biggest UN climate summit, but also at one of the most controversial in the history of the summits. And at least 1,700 lobbyists from the coal, from the gas, and from the oil industry have joined the climate summit. And I have a wonderful quote here from Azerbaijan president that kindly reminded attendees that fossil fuels are a gift of God. And apparently they are allocated also by divine decree. So in this context, we also have the US congressional representative from the Republican Party that just, again, assured us that technology can solve a lot of these problems without just banning fossil fuels. And that's a clear indication of also what's about to come during the next administration. But all of this unfolds while the UN chief is reminding us that in order to, of course, meet the pledges and the targets of the Paris Agreement, we still need to reduce global production and consumption of fossil fuels by at least 30%. So I couldn't be happier to be here with you today to have this conversation about AI developments and what it really means for the climate crisis we are facing. And I'm also happy because we are really looking at this from a variety of areas and a variety of perspectives. And so I'm very thrilled to welcome, and I am saying hi here, Nicole Starosielski, who is professor of film and media at the University of California, Berkeley, conducts research on global internet infrastructures with a focus specifically on the cables, the subsea cables that make up the infrastructures of the global internet. Then we have Sanjana Paul, that actually is the co-founder and executive director of EarthX, and also an environmental of course, an environmental hackathon organization, but also she's currently finishing an environmental policy and planning master's at MIT. And of course, Tamara Kneese, and I'm saying hi again, thank you for being here with us, both from California, who is senior researcher and project director of the Data and Society Algorithmic Impact Methods Lab, and former lead researcher at the Green Software Foundation. So what we're gonna do tonight and this morning for the online people and scholars joining us, I'm gonna give a brief introduction of around 15 minutes to really try to raise awareness on the complexities of the environmental harms generated by artificial intelligence and what we can perhaps do and how to tackle these major issues. And then we're going to go more into details with Nicole on the infrastructural issues that are crucial in an understanding of the problems, but then we'll also be looking at how environmental justice ideas can help us developing technology that is actually more sustainable, and also how through hackathons we can achieve that, and through green, what I like to refer as green tech literacy or green AI literacy. And then we'll close also with Tamara Kneese, who is going to provide an overview of what's been done in terms of policy, but also what we must do and what are the tools that we have available. So, is AI good for the planet? I think I've been dwelling with this question for many years now. And at the time when I started investigating this issue, I realized that the focus of scholarship and studies on the topic were focusing more on the issues around algorithm biases, on issues around erosion of critical thinking, or of course the risk to mass job displacement. But little at the time, and I'm talking in the last decade, little was written about AI and the relationship to the environment. And I think that if we look at the last year, we will see an extraordinary change in public debates about the relationship between AI and the environment. And in fact, you will see major headlines popping up, and actually also during the climate summit this week, about the environmental unsustainability of data centers. So the focus has highly been, crucially, on data centers. And I would certainly argue that the incredible take-up of generative AI has brought to the almost impossibility for what I like to refer as the digital lords of the West, not to talk and not to come clean about the problems of the energy and water consumption they have. And therefore, we have also, for the first time, a very worrisome sustainability report. We have the one by Google that actually had to report significant increases in terms of water consumption, and the Google data centers consumed 20% more water in 2022 compared to 2021. And very similar data are coming out on the environmental sustainability report of Microsoft. Again, in this case, we have a water usage that jumped by 34% during the same time frame. And of course, these are data that matter, and this is why the discussion has changed radically if we think of what we were looking at 10 years ago. But for me, what was really impressive this year has been this report coming from the International Energy Agency, because for the first time, we actually saw AI coming up in the report. And the agency actually argued really with data that training a large language model like OpenAI GPT-3 consumes nearly 1,300 megawatt hours per year. And of course, for us not experts in the space of energy studies, this is equivalent to around 130 US households consumption. So we're talking of big numbers. But I'm sure that you all noticed, at least since May, that Google has started experimenting heavily with the so-called Google overviews. So in other ways, we see that generative AI has been implemented and used much more in an experimental way in our searches, in our everyday searches. And so there is a paragraph of the energy report from the International Energy Agency that is very specific about this and actually claims that every single Google search normally uses something like 0.3 watt hours of electricity. But a request on ChatGPT, so a request and interaction with generative AI, would actually be 10 times more demanding in terms of consumption. And of course, all of this are for sure making us realize the extent of the problem and why this problem finally reached the public debate. And we are talking finally about the data centers demand of water and energy. But for me, what is really crucial in this debate, and this is why I really wanted to start animating the debate with this awareness, is that the consumption and environmental impact of AI does not start and end just with data centers. We need a more, to look at the complexity, we need an holistic framework to really look at the entirety and the complexity of the environmental harms by AI. And why is it? Why? Well, because it is crucial to remember that actually AI is more deeply embedded in every aspect of our life, from the smartphones to emerging devices we use. And so this means that the AI chain of production is increasingly integrated into the general digital chain. And this is really crucial because I struggle also to explain this to policymakers in conversation about AI. Why is it that we need to start by considering the entirety of the production, digital production chain of AI? And so you need to think, and this is the example that I think can help. You need really to think of AI as the electricity that is running into a town. You can't always see it, but it's powering everything, from the lights in your home to the cars you're driving. And just like electricity flows through wires to connect every building in the street, AI is being wired into every material object we use. So if we want to understand the complexity of these arms, we need to recognize AI in its unavoidable material reality as technologies, machines, and infrastructures. And this means that we need to move beyond restrictive, also in the reductionist approaches that are just looking at trying to simplify the environmental impacts of AI into just carbon metrics. But we really need an effort that is an interdisciplinary effort to try to draw on concepts that sometimes are not really placed together. So there are marvelous studies coming from computer science or from engineering, but very often they fail, to engage in a conversation with what geographers have to say about the impact, for example, of local communities or indigenous communities that have to deal with one segment of the global supply chain. In this case, of course, the extraction of the rare metals that are necessary for the devices to function. But also we need to engage with traditional ecologic knowledge. And I'm very, very impressed by the history of traditional ecologic knowledge and what we can learn about the way to be custodians of nature, the way to be guardians of nature, and how to build also technology that takes into account these principles. And of course, what is crucial here is we need to engage with each and every step in segments of the supply chain of AI. So to look at the entirety of the eco-political economy of AI means we need to start with the minerals. So with an analysis of the colonialist extraction of rare minerals and the metals that are essential for the fabrication of AI hardware. Lithium, cobalt, copper, nickel, and rare earth elements are all crucial for manufacturing AI-powered devices. And the demand for these minerals is increasing at a staggering level. So the European Commission just a few months ago actually predicted that the demand for lithium in the EU will increase to 18 times the current levels just by 2030. So by the time in which we are supposed to meet the famous 1.2, trying to protect the world and not going beyond the famous 1.5 threshold. And 60 times the current level by 2050. So how sustainable are these practices for the extraction of mineral resources? And what are the social and environmental costs for communities? And this all besides, and we should remember, the precarity of securing these resources. I mean, I think many of you will know, for example, that China is a dominant player in this market. But then normally, a lot of these mines are, of course, in the global south. And this, of course, is creating enormous problems with the mining operation discharge because they discharge toxic chemicals and generate vast amounts of hazardous waste, posing serious health harms for these communities. And these practices obviously frequently also devastate indigenous communities and are reminiscent of colonial exploitation with inhuman working conditions. So this is just the first segment. And then we move into the second. And I think the second segment is the one that is currently the most debated, precisely because of the staggering consumption of the data centers. And I have here this table because it's a table that I drew from my book, and I actually tried to make comparisons. So this was drawn in one of the first study that was done in 2019 by Massachusetts Armrest on one of the first example of trying to track the carbon emission of language models. And of course, we know that this is only a generalization. We know that it is dependent on the neural networks. We know that it's dependent on many factors, but to give you an idea of the problem that we're talking about, I had this table that was comparing the 284,000 kilograms of carbon emission due to the training of a model with us taking a flight from London to New York, from London to Rome. And you can see by yourself 234 kilograms for a flight between London to Rome, and something like 1,000 kilograms of carbon emission for a flight that connects London with New York. So again, these are massive problems that we can address, but it is important to be aware that at the moment, also with the incredible take-up of generative AI, we are in a situation where the so-called inference, so the phase in which we are interacting with AI, so not just the training, is incredibly demanding in terms of energy. So this is another problem that actually in 2019, yes, we acknowledged, but now it is another major issue. And then we are reaching the third major segment. And it's the last crucial link in the AI production chain, and its disposal. So when digital devices are discarded, they become electronic waste. And they leave local municipalities with the difficult task of ensuring safe disposal all the time. And what do we do with this? Unfortunately, a lot of this task, as the map of the UN shows, are offshored, with many countries, especially in the global south, that are becoming digital dumping grounds for us and more privileged nations. So according to the UN Global Waste Monitor, a record 62 million tons of e-waste was produced in 2022, and up of about 82% from 2010, and we are, according to the UN, on track to produce something like 82 million tons by 2030. And it's interesting because the UN has this image that represents a sort of an unbroken queue of digital waste from New York to Athens, from Nairobi to Hanoi. And interestingly enough, only 1% of the demand of rare earth elements that are crucial for these digital developments is fulfilled through e-waste recycling. So we are so behind. It's only 1%. So where does this bring us? Of course, it's important to be aware of this connection, and it is important really to understand the complexities of the challenges we have, but through interdisciplinary conversation like this one we're having tonight, we can really engage in conversation with the engineers that are currently really working hard, trying to develop also carbon trackers, trying to reduce their environmental footprint of the data centers, with engineers that are working in software, trying to green and making software also more sustainable, working with designers that are trying to achieve this. And but at the same time, it is crucial to bring all of this together in a in a conversation that looks at the entirety of the eco-political economy of AI instead of just looking at one segment or trying to simplify the problem. So now we're moving into a deeper understanding of the major infrastructures that are involved, in particular with the undersea cables, and are connecting to AI developments. So I'm very, very happy to welcome Nicole Starosielski. So. Hello, Nicole, welcome.
Hi, can you hear me?
Very well.
Excellent. All right, well, I'm very excited to be here. I'm very grateful for the opportunity to speak on a panel with such other fabulous presenters. So I think what I would like to do is walk you through a project that I've been working on and to speak a little bit about how this connects to the growing environmental impact of AI. My focus has been how do we mitigate that? And so I think in some ways I'm trying to do and put into practice some of the suggestions that you have laid out. So I work on subsea cables, which are the backbone of the internet. Over 99% of transoceanic internet traffic still is carried by these systems. About 500, right over 500 right now in operation. And that these are really necessary in terms of AI, although I think my scope is digital infrastructure, of which AI is a part, is that synchronized and sort of multimodal response of AI in a global context is enabled and requires subsea cable capacity. So here I'm drawing from some research that I conducted in collaboration with Ann Pasek of Trent University, who has been leading our team's work to map a carbon footprint of a subsea cable. These cables are often omitted from carbon footprinting studies. And in 2021, which is a while ago now, we teamed up with the Suboptic Foundation and we got a grant from the Internet Society Foundation to start Sustainable Subsea Networks, which was an initiative to try to enhance the sustainability of these systems. So here's a little bit of preview of Ann's work. This has been several years of dedicated time to develop a flexible tool that would estimate the carbon footprint of a subsea cable. We have collaboration with a number of manufacturers of subsea cables, and it's been a long journey to get data that can be shared publicly. Mostly, they're concerned with the data being shared with their competitors rather than a public audience. One of the other things that we did is we interviewed companies across the sector to find out what they were doing in terms of sustainability. A lot of the time, people weren't aware of what other companies were doing. They weren't aware of, the best practices. There isn't a huge margin in this sector of the digital infrastructure industry. It's not the same as data centers. So there's not a lot of excess resources for researchers to be digging up the best practices in sustainability. So we compiled that, and that went all the way from processes and certifications through installation, maintenance, business practice, and recovery and recycling. And we compiled that and published that in 2023. We also developed a map in order to, one of our goals was to spread information about best practices across the industry, right? So that way we can make a tangible impact on the CO2 emissions and mitigate those emissions through kind of spreading some of these best practices. So that required a lot of public communication. One of the things that we did was we convened the first industry-wide Congress on sustainability, which required all of the folks from different parts of the industry. So this would be like ship owners, people who work in marine maintenance, cable manufacturers, operators, recovery and recycling specialists, to come together to talk about, what kinds of best practices they were using, but more specifically, what kinds of metrics they would advocate for. A lot of our work has been very global. So we've gone to many places in order to understand what kinds of things they're doing on the ground. And when we visit places to disseminate our research, we also have extended conversations to understand, what are the constraints and limitations? What are the things that people are trying to do? And what does sustainability mean? In different countries and in different parts of the world. So it's very stakeholder-based engagement. We do a lot of dissemination within the industry, publications in the industry magazine on recommendations, areas for improvement, again, foregrounding those who are really already excelling in order to sort of set up a model that others can strive for. So the second phase of our project has been focusing on the development of metrics. And being trained in STS, I acknowledge all of the problems with metrics. I think that metrics are something that, should not be universal. But within this industry, there's a need for metrics because some companies are doing, are implementing sustainability practices, and they want a way to be able to show that they've done that work beyond ESG reports that, may get sort of simplified. They want to be able to broadcast that they've done this, and they want verifiable and credible means of assessing that against their competitors. So as just one example, we have a subgroup working on cable landing stations. And so the goal here is to focus on best practices in energy efficiency, looking specifically at the different kinds of equipment. How can you reduce environmental impact? And this is something that we circulated the first survey actually across the subsea cable industry to gain information about cable landing stations, about their operations, about the details, about their use of generators and so on. And then we're using that in relation to with some of the people who have created the best practices frameworks, like the EU Code of Conduct for Energy Efficiency for data centers, to assess what is going to work for this other industry, right? So we're not recreating the wheel. We're looking at the IMO when it comes to ships. We're looking at the data center industry when it comes to facilities and assessing what kinds of metrics have worked or haven't worked. One of the important things that we do is we work closely with students and we work with people around the world. So our work is highly collaborative. So this is just an example of, two students that recently went and presented on the problems and possibilities with PUE as a metric for sustainable cable landing stations at the Submarine Networks World in Singapore. And another student, former student, now making a documentary about this, interviewing members of the cable industry. And they collaborated with an engineer who works in a cable landing station in Egypt. And just today I had two students present in Portugal and in France, translating into Portuguese and French, work on subsea cable sustainability. So again, this is very kind of collaborative, on the ground, negotiated work. The last thing that I'll talk about is how I'm trying to set up a new structure for how to disseminate sustainability best practices and the work that should be done, and much of the work that people who are in this room and on the call have already conducted, which is to say there needs to be a means of training. I believe that one of the most powerful modes of intervention that we have is in our role as educators. And so I've developed a program in conjunction with other academics, with stakeholders around the world, and with people in the industry. That's a summer program available to anybody globally out of UC Berkeley on digital infrastructures that foregrounds AI and sustainability. And so the model of the program is that all of these different organizations like iMasons, Telegeography, Data Center Dynamics assist in the development of finding the best, the best practices in sustainable design, in community engagement. And then we also source information from across the academic community, from all of the people who have done such incredible work documenting environmental impact. That then is consolidated into a curriculum that is will be available for anyone who wants to enter the industry, right? So that way they'll be familiar not just with the components of what is a data center, how is it structured, what is inside of it, how does a subsea cable get laid, how do you build one, but that way they understand the importance of sustainability throughout the process. So just the critical takeaways. I believe that we need, at least in the subsea cable industry, we need deep collaboration in the building of trust with stakeholders around the globe. So I can't show up in places around the globe and tell people what to do. I have to spend time developing relationships with people, understanding the different social and cultural practices and meanings of sustainability, the regulation that people grapple with, whether it's effective, what kind of political context they exist within, and what are the needs on the ground. And I believe that academics and researchers have a crucial role to play in this conversation. And lastly, that multi-generational work across discipline and established hierarchies, just to sort of echo what's already been said, is essential to this process. So thank you for the time and space, and I will leave it there.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Nicole. And I think actually we are really connecting well with the next presentation of Sanjana Paul, who's really going to be telling us everything about what they're currently doing in this impressive organization that she founded. And of course, I'm very curious to know more about also how the principle of environmental justice can be brought in this implementation of a green AI literacy and green technology literacy with, of course, students involved and young kids involved and anyone that is interested. Thank you, Sanjana.
Thank you. Nicole, that was so cool. I'm definitely going to be emailing you. So thanks so much, everyone, for braving the rain to come out and to be here today. So my name is Sanjana. I wear a few different hats. I'm going to talk about a couple of them today. So I'm the co-founder and executive director of Earth Hacks, which is an environmental hackathon organization, as well as the co-lead of the Rooted Futures Lab, which is spinning out of Earth Hacks, very confusingly. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how some of that work connects to some of the topics we've been talking about today, AI, its environmental impact, environmental justice, and also how are we actually exposing people outside of this room to those topics and pulling more people into this conversation. So to just kind of set the stage, although it's been very well set already, we're here kind of to think critically about the environmental costs of AI. And this means a lot of things, has a lot of different dimensions. I feel I have barely scratched the surface here. I think that one thing people are becoming more and more familiar with is AI's energy footprint. So there's been a decent amount of media coverage just talking about, well, the physical reality is that the internet is kind of a place. It's a lot of places, includes data centers, and those data centers are very power hungry. Power that is feeding into those is not always, quote unquote, clean. It is very often dirty. So there's a big energy footprint and there's an associated pollution footprint with that. There's also dimensions that you might not think about so intuitively, like land grabbing, right? It's very land resource intensive to build physical data infrastructure, right? And where does that land come from? Who previously was on that land? So there's this question of, large tech companies or governments, with inordinate amounts of power compared to the people on the land that they're trying to move into, kind of jumping in and maybe, quote unquote, land grabbing. There's the pollution impacts, which I already kind of alluded to. And then there's this notion that the environmental impacts of AI are kind of hidden, right? When people are using ChatGPT, when they're generating pictures of Tyrannosaurus Rexes wearing tutus or whatever it is they're doing, they're probably not thinking about the water use. They're probably not thinking about the energy use. They're thinking, oh, I Google search all the time, right? So why can't I do this tool? So I would argue that's actually another huge cost, is that there's a bit of an information asymmetry there. So how do we teach people about this? Right? That was not exactly a fun set of topics that I just spoke about, right? It's kind of not so great to learn about this thing you thought was fairly innocuous actually has this big footprint. How do you put that in front of people from all walks of life, especially young people, and actually get them to engage with this in kind of a helpful way and a constructive way? So I don't think that there's one way to teach anything. I think that there are so many different ways, so many different pedagogies, but I will talk about a couple that I use. So first at Earth Hacks, which is, as I mentioned earlier, an environmental hackathon organization, our mission is really to harness hackathons as a form of climate action. So there's hundreds of these things that happen every single year. We work with students and organizations from all over the world and just kind of try to center climate and environmental science and climate and environmental topics in the work that's already happening. And with the Rooted Futures Lab, we're bridging an even more disparate gap, and we're bringing notions of environmental justice into the tech space. Because if STEM students are not learning about environmental science unless they're in an environmental science program, they're certainly not learning about environmental justice. So before I go on, I said this word maybe 15 times, but I did not define it. What is a hackathon? How many people have been to a hackathon before? Can we do a show of hands? Okay, that was like 3 people. How many people have heard of a hackathon before they walked into this room? That's why I like to do the check. So a hackathon traditionally is just a programming contest. You know, it has its roots in the open source software movement. Very stereotypically and hilariously, many times they happen in people's garages. And typically, you know, they're a weekend where people come together to teach each other new programming skills, new programming languages. Very often they compete against each other, they win prizes. And this has become super common on college campuses. So there's, I think, like 3 hackathons that NYU has. My university, MIT, has like 300 hackathons. I think there was one last weekend. There's one this coming weekend. It's like, it's all over the place. So they're really, I would argue, a mainstay of the tech space at this point. A lot of the people who are working in tech, a lot of the people who are software engineers working in AI have probably done at least one hackathon at this point. They're very popular, I think, on Silicon Valley campuses as well. So why should we focus on hackathons? Why does Earth Hacks even exist? For that reason. There's like hundreds of hackathons happening anyways. What a missed opportunity to not engage students in climate change education at those places where they have willingly given up their weekends to go sit in a room with people and code. So we kind of have 2 different dimensions for how we do this. We work with student-led hackathons to just get environmental focused challenge statements into what they're already doing. So we don't do a hostile takeover. We don't completely appropriate whatever their idea was. We just say, hey, you know, why hack at Yale? Great job organizing your hackathon. How about we do an environmental challenge statement? And this really pushes students to engage deeply with a specific aspect of environmental or climate issues because there's an incentive. They have to understand it better than the other people so they win the prize. So they walk away with this really deep knowledge of air pollution, of electric vehicles, of climate change communication, whatever the challenge statement was that we created. Or we work with organizations to focus more on prototyping, to kind of have people come together to build a first version of a tool, of a software, of something else that can help an organization achieve their goals. So these are some specific examples, which I realized I should have been paging through earlier, but you know, is really trying to support computer science students in engaging with environmental issues, because I think while this is starting to change this year, when I was in engineering school, which is not that long ago, we were certainly not learning about environmental issues. I took a whole power systems class and we didn't talk once about climate change's effect on renewable energy. We didn't talk once about the energy transition. And I was just floored because my question was, what kind of world are you preparing me for? You're not setting me up to be a good engineer in the 21st century. This is remedial education, I think, that we're doing at Earth Hacks. It's embarrassing that we don't teach, you know, STEM students about climate change. So this is one creative way to kind of get into the classroom, but kind of out of the classroom, and use experiential learning to get students really excited and engaged about this. And then for kind of these more organization-focused events, hackathons, in addition to being really great spaces for learning, are really great spaces to test out kind of first versions of different ideas. So when we work with organizations over the course of a weekend, many times we're just kind of doing R&D for them on a very fast time scale. If someone says, build me a map, right, and they're an environmental organization, they definitely have a person on their staff who can build a map. It's probably just that they need to iterate a few different versions of the map. They need to figure out what kind of data they want to use, who their client is, so we speed that process up. So one of my favorite examples is Amazonia Hack, which is a virtual, bilingual in English and Portuguese hackathon focused on open innovation for the Amazon rainforest. So we work with a coalition of Brazilian organizations. That's why it's in Portuguese. I'm slowly learning on Duolingo. You know, to work on all of these pressing issues around the various dimensions of deforestation in the Amazon. What about indigenous farming? How do we support them, right? What about, acoustic monitoring? How do we look into that as a solution? Can we predict logging patterns? So looking at all of these different issues, in collaboration with different orgs to accelerate their R&D and to resource maybe places that haven't been resourced. Shameless plug, this is this weekend if you are interested in testing out your first hackathon. And so how to get back specifically into this AI question, how specifically can hackathons be kind of these testing grounds for AI and environmental impact education, right? Because again, many of the people at hackathons are computer science students. They're the people who are going to build AI systems. So one thing that we've been testing is actually a good old PDF, is an AI disclaimer. So we've been piloting this at a couple of our hackathons to say, hey, we know that when you come in here, you work on your project, you may or may not be using generative AI, and that is what it is. It's not a value statement. But we just want you to know that AI has, inordinate energy consumption. There's all of these other considerations that we want you to think about. And we just kind of end up, with this closing line, encouraging them to use human intelligence and AI strategically. And so in the very preliminary interviews we've done, not formally, maybe this is a study someone in this room wants to do, we've seen that this really simple behavioral intervention of just giving them the information that they've never been exposed to did actually kind of change their decision a little bit whether or not they were going to use AI, because they were just like, we didn't know. Like, I just thought it would write my code faster for me. Like, I didn't know that. So this is one way where you have an audience of students who presumably cares both about computer science development and AI and the environment. They don't know this. And then you put it in front of them and you do see that does have a positive impact on them so far. So this is one way that we're kind of trying to bring this conversation up in hackathons. But it really struck me when we started doing this, like, why don't those students know that? Right, again, these are people who are supposedly interested in both computer science development and environmental issues. So like, how is it that that information has not reached them? And so I think that this is because, we really need to carefully consider how these decisions happened, how and why are we creating the technology and the infrastructure that we do? And who is we who gets to be a part of that decision-making process? Do students see themselves as AI architects and kind of leaders in the environmental space while being in the tech space? Or do they see themselves as just kind of, well, I'm looking for a job and so I'll do whatever, which is understandable, but maybe not the most empowering framework. We want to kind of ask this question of like, how did this happen in the first place, right? So rather than just kind of like being reactive to the environmental impacts of AI, we kind of want to try and push students to think about how are those AI systems built and how are different forms of maybe generative AI prioritized when we hadn't figured out any of these questions, when we hadn't figured out community benefits agreements, when we haven't thought about the water usage. Why is it that some people decided to prioritize the development of these AI systems anyways, right? So how did this happen? And how do we teach that? Again, this raises questions that I think are very uncomfortable in the science technology, in the STEM space, right? Is that we are kind of taught to see the space as very value neutral. But when you think about how did this happen? Why did decision makers prioritize AI at the expense of, land rights or water or what have you? You have to start thinking about power, and you have to start thinking about harm. And you have to start thinking about agency. And not only are those topics uncomfortable in traditional STEM spaces, I would argue we have absolutely no concept of how to engage with them in a constructive way. Because our objective isn't just to kind of put these terms in front of people and say, you messed up. Our objective is to put these terms in front of people and say, how do you think about this in a helpful way to design different tech systems? And that's what we're really interested in trying to teach. And so we've started to develop at the Rooted Futures Lab, spinning a little bit more into that now, we've started to develop this framework of environmental justice in technology. And so environmental justice, and I'm going to do another show of hands, how many people were familiar with that term before they walked in the room? Okay, a lot more people on that one. So for those of us who are still learning, it's a very multidimensional phrase. In our practice at Earth Hacks and at Rooted Futures, we use Dr. Robert Bullard's definition. Robert Bullard is commonly referred to as the father of environmental justice. He's a sociologist who was looking at waste facility siting. And those facilities tend to be very polluting. And he found that they were sited in poor neighborhoods disproportionately. He found they were sited in racialized neighborhoods disproportionately. And so his definition of environmental justice is just that everyone, regardless of class, of race, of income, whatever category you'd like to use, has the right to equal environmental protection and enforcement of that protection. And so complementary to that is this notion of environmental injustice, when you actually don't have that enforcement of equal environmental protection, when you do have to bear the burden of a polluting power plant in your community that's not even delivering you power, maybe it's delivering power to people elsewhere, when you do have to deal with polluted water and you do have to see your family getting sick. So environmental injustice, that what I just spoke about, we argue that that doesn't just happen. It's not just something that we react to. It's something that's proactively created. Scientists, technologists, engineers, planners make deliberate decisions to cite things in places leading to environmental injustice. And so again, when you're teaching this or when you're sharing this concept to, a bunch of freshman computer science students, it's definitely a downer, but that's not the point. The point is to say, if people made these decisions, people can make different decisions. And we want you to be able to be comfortable speaking about these topics so that you can conceptualize helpful responses as scientists and engineers to them. And one way we argue that they can do that is by thinking about the engineering design process, by thinking about decision-making and planning processes, and just this notion of environmental justice, that equal enforcement of environmental protection, not being kind of a nice to have or a tech for good initiative, but actually being a base criteria, actually arguing that we're violating basic health and safety standards by not pursuing environmental justice. And so a few of the different ways that we've started to try and disseminate these ideas and try and shake up the STEM pedagogy a little bit to engage with these concepts is through MOOCs. How many people have used a MOOC before, or taken a MOOC? Okay, so MOOC, I should maybe define it. It's a massive open online course. So you've probably seen, if you're on LinkedIn, like those somewhat spammy ads, right? It's like, oh, join our course and learn all about product development in like 6 weeks. That's a MOOC. Some of them are better than others. So we've worked with a whole bunch of different people in community to create this MOOC called Environmental Justice, Science and Technology. And just kind of talking about environmental justice. It's very US-centric. Environmental justice is a global concept, but we focus for now on the United States, and how it intersects with science and technology, and how science and technology can actually be helpful tools to advance environmental justice and that equal protection from pollution. So this is actually the first course ever at MIT to bring together these pedagogies of environmental justice in STEM. Better late than never, but I think that really shows how, reluctant the STEM space has kind of been to engage with some of these questions, but now it's becoming kind of increasingly obvious as we deal with climate change and other environmental degradation. And so I just want to kind of start to wrap up with this other notion that we've developed to kind of try and help people, wrap their heads around these, which are the environmental justice and technology principles. So the environmental justice movement actually released principles in 1991. I think it's like the 17 or the 19 principles of environmental justice. And if you look that up and if you read through it, it's just kind of basic agreements about how, practitioners should move through that space. What are the commitments? What are we trying to do? What's the purpose of having this as a movement in the first place? And we've created an analog for environmental justice in technology to try and think about why is it always, we're looking at we're reacting to tech harms to the environment. Why can't we build technology for a flourishing world instead? And so why can't we have both of those things together? And so I just wanted to highlight a couple of them that I think are particularly relevant to this question of AI and environmental justice, and that we use when we're having kind of discussion circles with students about it. So first is just kind of like the deployment question, right? Is where are AI centers going? Who's deciding that? Why are they there? What resources are they using? And we argue that, taking an environmentally just technology approach would call for the deployment of technology when and where it's appropriate and beneficial to the local community. So rather than kind of citing a very power-hungry set of resources near a community that doesn't want it, if they get some sort of community benefit from it, maybe they would be much more amenable to it. And so we argue when these criteria aren't met, which they could be, environmentally just technology is not being deployed. We also bring in this question about harm. So I talked about power, I talked about justice earlier, but I think another very helpful metric, even though we were discussing the relative benefits metrics earlier, another helpful metric is harm. So we say that environmentally just tech is intentional about harm, and that it's cognizant of who a technology helps and who it harms, because there's no such thing as a free lunch. You always have an impact when you do something. And simply, kind of like engaging with that reality to understand what it is can help you make better decisions about how to mitigate that harm. Oh, I thought there was one more, but I guess that's it. So yeah, kind of closing, kind of closing out over there. Speed run through some of the work we do with Earth Hacks and Rooted Futures, but really our idea is trying to prepare students to engage with these topics in a helpful way so that we move from this kind of reactive stance to, oh no, tech is making bad things happen to the environment, to we can do better. We can build less harmful technology. We can build non-polluting technology. We can do it in collaboration with communities. We just have to think about these uncomfortable questions in order to be able to do so. So very eager to continue the conversation, but thank you so much for having me.
So thank you so much, Sanjana. And I think we're moving now with Tamara Kneese into the space of policy, because we are now going to hear about what are some of the solutions that have been provided, but also what we are missing, and what to do about all these concerns. We saw already that intervention within the space of literacy are indeed crucial, but I'm looking forward to hear from you, Tamara, about also the policy opportunities. Thank you.
Thank you. And if, I don't know, I guess we could just make my face really huge or something because I don't have slides, because I just came straight from giving a talk at Mills College, and so I am in a random office space, and I wasn't sure if I would have good Wi-Fi and would have to beam in by phone. So we'll just have a sort of surreal experience, I guess, of my giant head talking to you. But it's really lovely to be here with you all. And I think, you know, those of us on the panel, we have so many points of overlap and connection. And I've had a few conversations with everybody on the panel. And so it's wonderful to think about how our work fits together, even though it's all very different methodologically. And so I will introduce myself just by saying that I'm the director of a new climate technology and justice program that was just quietly launched at Data and Society. And this is built really on the work that I've been doing as the director of the Algorithmic Impact Methods Lab at Data and Society Research Institute, which has really been about the applied practice of attempting to figure out how to take risk assessment frameworks and the practice of conducting algorithmic impact assessment and mapping it onto real life examples. And so there have been a lot of policy recommendations around how to measure, assess, and mitigate risk related to AI systems. There's also been a lot of chatter within different corners of tech policy and within academic circles as well around how to bring different stakeholders into the evaluation process. And so AIM-Lab was founded on the notion that these efforts should be community-led, they should be participatory, and we should have the communities who are most likely to be impacted negatively by these AI systems, that we should bring them into the evaluation process. And hopefully that this evaluation would happen during the ideation and development phase, rather than bringing in impacted communities to kind of vet systems after they've already been fully developed and potentially deployed. So just to like give you a brief example of like what this might look like. So if we're kind of worried about the implications of a computer vision technology being introduced in the city, we might bring in different civil rights groups in the area who have concerns about surveillance, privacy, relationships to law enforcement or housing that might come up as a result of these particular systems. And we have workshops where we hear from communities. And then the idea is that this feedback then goes to the developers or deployers. And the hopeful part is that we would enact some kind of change. So in some cases, we've been able to stop projects that are really a terrible idea, or at least slow them down. And so, you know, this is definitely like very tricky kind of work that lives partially outside of academic research, partly outside of normal sort of day-to-day policy work. And so I've been leading a number of new projects that are specifically looking at the environmental impacts of AI infrastructures and materialities. Because often when we're evaluating AI systems for harm, we're dealing with things like bias, which of course is very important, but some of the other material effects of AI are not usually part of these evaluation frameworks. And there have been a lot of attempts within responsible AI circles to kind of add more of a pillar around sustainability. And again, sustainability, as we've kind of talked about, can be a very nebulous term, and therefore it can be very difficult to actually affect change. And so earlier today, I was on a panel for NIAC, which is the National AI Advisory Council that informs, the Biden administration for now, their policy around AI. And I was supposed to talk about the relationship between energy, hardware, and AI. And other than me and Emma Strubel, everybody else there was a member of the tech industry or the government. And so this has been very common in a lot of the other stakeholder engagement conversations I've been part of for national academies and NIST in partnership on AI, where the people in the room look a lot like me. They tend to be people with PhDs. They're highly paid white collar professionals. Well, I'm not highly paid, but you get the idea. And so the communities who are likely to be impacted, civil rights organizations, workers themselves, data workers, are often absent from these conversations. And so when it comes to stakeholder engagement practices, who is actually being given a voice, and we love to create evaluation and risk management frameworks and protocols, but do they actually work? And so we have seen some movement happening within the policy arena when it comes to measuring and reporting and hopefully also mitigating AI's environmental impacts. And so we've seen some conversations around, carbon intensity or energy efficiency, a desire to maybe point to the water cost of AI systems. And there is pending regulation like the AI Environmental Impacts Act of 2024, which called for empirical studies to produce standards for measuring the full spectrum of AI's environmental impacts. And the EU AI Act also calls for a kind of standardization process for determining AI's environmental impacts by comparing the emissions connected to different models. This is pretty similar to the way that researchers at Hugging Face have called for an Energy Star program for AI models to compare them for various environmental factors. But I'll say, as someone who has spent a fair amount of time researching the gaps between policy and implementation, as somebody who worked on a green software product team at Intel and also led research for the Green Software Foundation and was part of the policy working group there, which is very heavily involved with international standards for the measurement of things like carbon emissions. There's really a need for grassroots activism and external agitation in order to enact meaningful change. Because there are limits to what policy alone can do, especially if policymakers are only focused on quantitative measurements of carbon, water, and other environmental factors. And as Nicole said, the metrics are important, and so we may need them in order to be able to make a legal case. But at the same time, if we're limited to just a few environmental factors, we may miss the larger infrastructural impacts. So, the problem with the framework is that it really is only as useful as the kind of data that you build into it and how it is applied to different use cases. And environmental justice concerns are essentially missing from policy conversations because it can be very difficult to make those environmental impacts legible, visible, or tangible. You can't report on or change what's not being measured by existing methods and standards. So some of the things that are definitely not being captured at all in the conversations that I'm a part of are the health impacts of data centers, including noise pollution and air pollution, the loss of clean water, the loss of agricultural land, increased utility costs, and other factors that are not captured by these quantitative approaches. And in policy circles, all of these different categories are generally referred to as negative externalities, right? And so there's a way of kind of just lumping them all into one category. And yet, thinking about how these different impacts would play out in different geographic regions, even in the US, let alone globally, is something that really needs a lot more attention from policymakers. And so looking at the full life cycle also, of course, has been a very, astutely put it, the e-waste impacts of rapid technological development. So part of the problem is now computer hardware is being outdated even more quickly because of the fast pace of innovation. And so, refurbishment and circular design now more than ever should be part of the policy solutions that aim to mitigate the environmental impacts of AI. But it's very hard for circularity to gain traction within tech companies because obviously that would hurt their bottom line. Why would they want to design devices and servers that can live longer if they can be repaired and refurbished, when that means, of course, they will sell fewer products? And so, what I found through my work at Green Software Foundation and at Intel as well, energy efficiency is usually the thing that you can sell to C-suite because it can be packaged as a kind of cost savings. So you're saving on, your electricity bills, for the data center. But, that is typically the only green measure that really carries a lot of weight. And again, as we've talked about also, we can't really limit this just to the AI boom. And we really need to acknowledge the much larger and longer problem of the entire computing industry relying on these patterns of exploitation and extraction. And also, I think the knowledge of how data centers are affecting different parts of the world unevenly. And so what does it mean to put one in an area that is already experiencing drought? And then, how is a data center in one area affecting everyone on the grid, right? Like it is affecting people outside of the immediate vicinity also of the data center. When thinking about how policy decisions in one region impact environmental concerns in other regions or part of the world. And so this really has to be a global effort, or we're going to see certain countries or regions or states, as we're already seeing, being flooded with AI infrastructures in the same way that we did with Bitcoin, when Bitcoin mining was essentially banned in most places and then came to live in the US. Just recently, we're also seeing at the state level kind of the calls for environmental policy at a state level being undermined by state governments themselves. So an example is in Michigan, state lawmakers are pushing through tax breaks for a hyperscaler data center that will raise costs for residents and also go flagrantly against state climate goals. And so, part of what we've seen too is that, especially during like 2020, 2021, the kind of rhetoric of net zero and other climate targets, the measurement of scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions or ESG factors, these were things that major tech companies were talking a lot about, and that has definitely faded into the background. But there is still forever this sense that somehow AI will be useful to climate change mitigation strategies, and we don't fully know how or why. And part of this is just like the obfuscation that the term AI affords. So I think when we're talking about AI, especially within policy circles, it would be very helpful to differentiate between what kind of AI and what kind of use case we're actually talking about. And as we've seen with the growth of generative AI in particular, companies like Microsoft are now blowing way past their emissions targets as they expand their data centers, which are, of course, also carbon intensive to manufacture, and looking at the application. So part of the reason that the measurement of and the creation of standards around the environmental impacts of AI can be so difficult is that there's a tendency to only focus on training and inference and not on use. So what does it mean if you have, Microsoft also working with oil companies and using AI to accelerate oil and gas extraction? And so, I would just say finally that, in the US, we're seeing the limits of federal regulation that can quickly be undone. So like what role will the EPA play in carrying out the work of enforcing standards around AI's environmental impacts when they're going to be actively dismantled and undermined? And again, we really need this to also be a bottom-up kind of movement. And so I've been looking at the kind of tracking work that is being done by Good Jobs Now and Athena Coalition, where activists are really looking very closely at the relationship between local and state governments, energy infrastructures, tech companies, and utilities, and tracking the subsidies handed over to big tech companies. And so in order for data representing AI's environmental impacts to be actionable, we also need to think about how these findings will be operationalized within tech companies and governments, and how such frameworks relate to broader systems of labor and power. And so I will stop there.
Thank you, Tamara, for a wonderful intervention talk. So I'm actually taking questions from the public online and here at IPK. And we're gonna start with questions that we might have here. And then Mike is also gonna help us with the questions coming from the public online. I would say here, we start. Thank you.
Hello. Thank you, everyone, for great information. Just for, we're actually a group that came from the L'Oreal Group, the beauty company, and we're part of our finance transformation department. And this is part of kind of a learning for us because we're thinking about, our department's in charge of thinking about future forward topics, such as data and tech, AI, and sustainability, which are at odds with each other in this case, right? So it's our incentive as a corporation to build technologies to become, so that our workforce can be more efficient, so that we can be future forward, so that we can connect with the consumer, et cetera. And at the same time, we're a French company, so we're obliged under CSRD in Europe to report on various financial metrics and extra financial metrics such as destructions, waste, how we operate in our plants, et cetera. So it's a very fascinating topic for us because these two objectives are at direct odds with each other. So I guess I'm just thinking, in terms of tech companies, do we know any best practices of certain policies, maybe in the US that may not be as effective anymore, or outside the US that are particularly effective in regulating or providing the right incentives in this space? Because what I see in our company is that indeed there are incentives to drive sustainable actions, and we've invested in our plants in the right way. We have KPIs to reduce waste, et cetera. So I'm wondering, have we also seen in the research certain effective policies or regulations that will change the right kind of behavior within tech companies?
Thank you. So I want to invite all of you who wants to take this question. Tamara, Nicole, Sanjana, or I will. I guess. Well, I mean, it's a very important question, and I think it's a question that we are dwelling with all the time. And I think also in the public we have environmental lawyer from the European Union. I see her there, and I had a conversation about precisely this topic, because the reality is that even with the AI Act, for example, despite the fact that, yes, there are opportunities, for example, for voluntary intervention, from the company, I thought of it as a great missed opportunity to effectively really regulate, the demands and what can be done in this space. For example, in California, I mean, we know that we have the new climate disclosure rules that I think, of course, they're not just for tech, but they are extremely useful in encouraging the kind of reporting that we need, right, from corporations. And of course, they apply also to tech companies. So I think that actually what we saw also with the SEC has been particularly important. So with also the Financial Risk Act that was implemented in California in 2023 and the new SEC regulation. Having said that, I think there is so much actually to do, because whenever we are asked really we are a tech company or we are a company that really cares about sustainability, what should we do? What can we do to contribute? We really don't have the full standard, and especially following the entirety of the global supply chain, we really don't have the right regulations yet. So I actually think what you could do, because you are also in the European Union, would be really to engage with the standards that actually are currently implemented and demand for more, because actually from an academic perspective and also working with activists, working with NGO organizations, we are demanding more, but we're still lagging behind in this space. So I wish I had more good news, but I really don't. And actually, I was reading reports coming from the Climate Summit today, and I was seeing that there was a lack of participation of big tech groups this year. And I think that actually one of the reasons was also because precisely of this debate on data center sustainability and the fact that we don't really have a solution yet. We're working on many solutions, but I think it's a combination of major policy toolkits that have to be adopted. So there is not just one response. So I don't know, Sanjana, if you had, and I don't know, can they hear us? No? Yes, Tamara, okay. So if you want to jump in, let us know.
Sure, I can add a little bit onto that. I would say I really agree with that last part of the answer, that I don't think we have the ideal sort of policy handbook right now. And I think, again, it comes back to those questions that we're trying to teach our students about, is like relative amounts of power, right? There are a lot of activists and there are a lot of individuals and academics who are doing this work and trying to put it in front of regulators. But companies in a capitalist world have power that we just don't. And so I think that I really agree. You could really set a very positive example by kind of saying, hey, we recognize there's a gap in this space. We actually don't have a method to do this business sustainability. That's kind of a problem for our long term, is it not? So I think that there's kind of like a power question, and then there's just a very fundamental economic system question of being able to kind of look past the quarter and think about long-term economic sustainability, for which we do need a thriving planet.
Have we seen companies that have, do you have anyone in your research have seen companies that are particularly doing it well, balancing that? Because indeed, it's a question of agency and economics, and you see the principal agent problem at hand here. I think in our company, we are attempting to balance the noble goals versus the shareable goals, and we're trying to be respectful to obviously the reporting obligations, but obviously it's you see it's easy to see the economic incentive tension right here. But do we see any companies that have been success that we could look to as particularly good examples for this?
Do you have any good examples that I can offer?
I used to think I did, but I think unfortunately you just see that it seems to just be a trend, right? They're like, people are interested and are searching more, so we can advertise around this, so let's do this. And then, I think we were talking about actually the lack of tech companies at COP earlier today, and I'm really getting this sense because I failed to mention this. I'm an electrical engineer and I worked in the hardware space for 4 years. I'm really getting the sense that a lot of people in the tech space have just kind of decided that climate isn't really that interesting anymore, and they just kind of would rather focus on other things like AI. And so I think that there was a lot of momentum that was building that was very positive. And for me, it just hasn't stood up to the action that it needs to deliver. So I really liked, especially what Microsoft was doing with their early sustainability reporting. I had mixed feelings about what Google was doing, but I think that there were some really great actions they were taking. But I'm not seeing it reach the levels that it needs to reach by any stretch of the imagination. So I think that there's promising signals, but I think we have a huge opportunity to actually get it right.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think we had another questions. Yes, Anna.
Hi, thanks so much. So as a historical sociologist, I love how applied everything that you're doing is. So my question is specifically about your work with students. So this goes to Sanjana, but also Tamara and Nicole in some ways. As you're sending these students out and as they're starting their jobs in tech companies, what are they reporting back to you? Where are the main pain points? Where's the opposition? So the first question was very much about incentives, what incentives can be given to companies. My question is kind of critical, historical, skeptic, grumpy old person, is where are the pain points and how is it different between tech companies and fossil fuel companies? So are we seeing something entirely different about how these companies operate, and what are the experiences?
Yeah, that's a really great question. Thank you for that. So first, I think this is an interesting question because our students end up in so many different spaces, not just tech. In fact, we've seen that a lot of students who are they do have tech backgrounds, they're more interested in going into the environmental organizing space because they feel disillusioned by the tech space. But for those people who do want to go in tech, I will share it's very often the students that I've spoken with, and again, this isn't a formal survey, this is conversations with kids at hackathons. I mean, it's really driven by kind of this sense of like financial insecurity and just saying, if I go and if I be an engineer and if I, do this kind of boring software engineering job, I'll have time to do environmental volunteering. And it kind of, I've seen this trend emerging in the past few years, and it really makes me sad. That it really makes me sad that we failed so badly as a tech industry, that these things are completely polar opposites, and that tech companies really do see environmental initiatives as tech for good, which to me suggests that their main operations are tech for bad. So they've set themselves up for not very good binary there. So I think that kind of a lot of the pain points really come down again to the economics. Right? Is that, if I'm talking to a student, they're like, I was talking to my boss and I was trying to figure out how we could maybe like retrofit our office building or something. That's always the first barrier, right? Is how are we going to pay for it? And when I speak to students, I'm like, there are any number of studies showing about how upfront investments in renewable energy technologies pay for themselves. There's also this more basic existential question of climate change is not a trend. Well, it's a trend in that the planet's warming, but climate change is not a trendy topic. It's something that fundamentally affects our ability to live on this planet, right? And so for the long-term sustainability of a company, you do have to think about climate change, which is a case that Rebecca Henderson, who's an economist, an economics professor at Harvard, makes in her book, Reimagining Capitalism in a World on Fire, which I thought was really useful. But, I then tell students about it, but they've already been a little bit disheartened. So I would say if I had to find a singular pain point, it comes down to those economics that, we can't really have anything that goes against short-term shareholder value. It doesn't matter how big of an issue it is. So there are other things, right? There are other things about like, we don't have the capacity on staff to do an initiative like that. And I'm like, okay, that's fair, right? That's a solvable problem. But speaking to students, that's been my experience, is that they run into barriers with leadership about economics. I don't know if that's representative or if other people have different experiences, but those are some of the conversations I've had.
Thank you. I think we have many questions coming from
Yeah, we have a few questions in the chat, but I'll read the
Word.
most recent one. This is from Bennett Attaway. The tech industry loves to claim that AI will solve the climate crisis. So I really appreciate Tamara calling out how vague that claim is. How do you push back against the narrative that the theoretical future benefits of large-scale AI development outweigh the costs? I see Tamara's already provided a brief response in the chat, but feel free to expand, or anyone else can address this question.
Yeah, I mean, I would just say that, having real evidence of how exactly different AI infrastructures or products are harming people in real life is useful, and just like attempting over and over again to kind of scream as loudly as you can about it. I mean, I think all of us who are in this sort of world get used to saying the same thing over and over and over again. There are many tech critics who have been saying the same thing since like the 90s or earlier, and things have not changed. And, as Sanjana said, like the economic model obviously makes it very difficult. I'll also say, I am less engaged with students these days, but, seeing younger tech workers kind of get excited about making change in the world and doing tech for good and getting into climate oriented projects within large tech companies. So looking at the trajectory of people like Holly and Will Alpine, who were really, big people within the green software kind of movement. Holly was doing community engagements around data centers at Microsoft. Was the co-founder of their employee resource group for people who care about climate at Microsoft. And there's a lot of volunteerism and people doing that kind of work. And, Holly quit in a very high profile way, in part because of these relationships between Microsoft and oil and gas companies. And so I think a lot of people have a moment of disillusionment. And then, instead of, just forgetting about it or giving up, it's like you find other tactics. And so maybe you build coalitions, maybe you get involved more with like tech worker organizing in a different way. which is, what I have been involved with since 2017 in Tech Workers Coalition. And so I think there are just different ways of approaching the problem. And sometimes, you do need people on the inside. I really do think you do, but not all change can happen internally. And companies, as pressured as they may seem, they're often too big and too powerful for it to matter. And honestly, I'll just say finally that legal, if they're the only thing sort of in between a product shipping and not, legal often will check the box. You can apply the responsible AI framework and check the box for sustainability, but that may not actually be considering the real impacts, especially impacts that are longer term.
Yeah, and I also think that all of us in this room really believe in discourse change. So for us, what is really crucial is trying to change the debate. And this is also why we're here. So trying really to get people also from a variety of industry, from the art world, institutions that are contributing in raising awareness to these problems. I mean, I'm always saying good stories and good storytelling are crucial. And we were discussing this with Sanjana earlier, like a video games, for example, that is developed in this way, to raise awareness on the environmental impact of technologies is crucial to reach out to a younger audience. But also stories that are coming out more frequently now, for example, from cities like Dublin that have embraced an incredible speed in digitization and in building data centers. They decided to have a sort of a moratorium on building data centers. Very often these stories are not coming easily to us. And I think there is also a failure of journalism and reporters not being trained properly in reporting on these issues. Because as we find, also for us, working, for example, I'm teaching media and communication and political science students. And so it's a different type of students, not engineers, but they are incredibly engaged and come to us and they say, okay, what can I do as a citizen, but what can I do also as a future, maybe media worker? And so it's a big problem also with the lack of funds, for journalism, for example, in this space, because you need to have, as she showed brilliantly at the beginning, an understanding of tech, but also an understanding on environmental issues and how do you tackle them. So it is an expertise that I think we really need to work also together with the examples that Nicole provided and Tamara provided, like trying really to bring together a coalition of people coming from a variety of disciplines that often don't talk to one another. This is also why we've been lagging behind in addressing this. Yeah. But crucially, changing discourse is the biggest step that we can take, and showing that we have already a lot of stories to discuss, I think, and a lot of evidence. So we just need to connect and make sure that this reach a wider audience. So did we have, yes?
We have time like one.
Yeah, okay. So because I saw that there was another question at the back. Yes, thank you.
Hi, thank you. So do you have any insight about what do you think drives more the problem with tech? Is it services or products? Because with AI, right, there's the training, the product of the product is one thing, the use is another. While with Apple, if they would just release less products, their emission would be improve considerably. So I was wondering, do you have any insight about what the kind of the feedback loops between them, or what is driving more problems and what is less currently?
Sure, I can start. I think my kind of standard answer to a lot of these questions is it depends. I think that there's some products that are a lot more intensive, some services that are a lot more intensive. And I think maybe the layer of information behind that is actually where the issue is just like, why are we doing this in the first place, and who's going to use it, and what purpose does it serve? Because I feel in a lot of AI-centric discussions, this analogy that we learn about when you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail, we kind of use AI as a stand-in for very real societal issues and very real issues that we should have been addressing anyways. So I think that in some cases, going back to this earlier question of people say AI are going to help us with the environmental issues we're facing, but they don't say how. It depends on the specific topic that we're talking about. I think that there's a huge place for AI services, for example, when it comes to renewable energy optimization on the grid. That is an AI application that I'm very excited about. I'm much less excited about AI. Have you heard the term AI slop? I'm much less excited about AI slop, which is just kind of like poorly generated images with 6 fingers, you know, and like quickly written articles that are just kind of like weird BuzzFeed-esque blog posts. So I'm less excited about services like that. So I think it really depends on just, is this filling a real need? You know, this question of who is it helping and who is it harming? Can we justify the resource intensity of creating this product or service depending on what it's going to do? So I think that was maybe a very vague answer, but I think ultimately it just depends on the purpose and like the relative benefits and burdens of how that's going to be applied.
I want to give a chance also to Tamara Nicole, if you want to add. Otherwise, I'll just say that actually for us, all of us, you know, really trying to increment the right of repair, which in the European Union has been a major, you know, achievement, is something that we all believe in, because actually when you look at the extreme increase of e-waste, you know, that is an intervention that we all think that would be really crucial. How do you achieve that? I mean, I don't think that actually we can hope in self-regulatory codes, right? To achieve that, we need really to actually intervene. And, you know, I mean, it's always easier for me to have this conversation in Europe because there is an approach to intervention in terms of regulation of tech that is different from the US. But when I saw today what has been decided actually on Google and finally recognizing, you know, the incredible monopolistic power they have and demanding, you know, that they don't, you know, that they dismiss and they, you know, Chrome, and we will see what this will develop into. I mean, I think that's the kind of intervention that we will need, because very often when we talk about regulation, we think, okay, I mean, we're gonna limit something, but the regulation has been used traditionally in tech or in the media industries and in the creative industries also to create more. So there is also regulation for public obligation, regulation in the public interest. For example, having content for kids has always been a type of regulation that was in place. So it's not that, I mean, necessarily we need to limit, you know, by implement certain regulation. We could say we want a certain type of technology that is actually in the public interest, and we define the public interest, which is actually very similar to a trade-off between, do we need, you know, this product? Do we need this application? Because there are also wider problems. So I showed the level of incredible and impact in terms of energy of generative AI in search, okay, in the search that we're doing. And we saw how Google has implemented overviews since May. But what about the fact that by implementing this type of searches, we are clearly forbidding users from seeing the sources that this information were coming from. So in this way, really, really endangering the role of journalism, for example. So is this in the public interest? And then we can have also the conversation on the environmental impact. But I'm very worried on, you know, multiple matters, you know, when it comes to the implementation of generative AI in searches. So again, do we need this? Is it something that is gonna, you know, help society developing or not? So these are crucial questions. And I think with this very optimistic outlook, maybe we can close the event. I really want to thank Tamara and Nicole. I don't see Nicole anymore, but I'm sure she's there for a fantastic panel, for sharing all your insights coming from your project. And I'm sure that we'll be doing more things together. And I want to thank you, of course, Sanjana, that came from Boston, despite the weather and despite the very busy schedule. And to you for being here tonight, and to the people at home that have been joining this conversation. Again, changing discourse on these matters is the crucial way, and for all of us. So let's try to do this together. And thank you very much for being here.